Welcome to Plants and People. I'm your host, Nathan Bynum. Today I'll be interviewing Kayleigh Walters, who is the Living Collections cataloger for the Smithsonian Gardens. Part of what she does is researching ethnobotany. Today I'll talk to her about that, as well as some of the plants that have been on her mind and you can see at the Smithsonian Gardens. Well, thank you so much for being here, Kayleigh. I really appreciate your being here on the inaugural episode of Plants and People.
Of course.
And I understand that you study, or that part of what you do is ethnobotany, and I have no idea what that is. Can you tell us what ethnobotany is?
Of course. I love talking about that because most people haven't heard of it. So ethnobotany, in the most basic definition, is a combination of anthropology and botany. Anthropology being study of people and cultures, botany, study of plants. And so it's studying how cultures around the world use plants in medicinal, religious, cultural ways, seeing what we can learn from that.
Wow, that's really interesting. I always thought of plants as being separate from people, but of course that's completely not true. I eat them every day, and and of course they've been used for all kinds of purposes since the history of people.
Yeah.
So what do ethnobotanists do in an average ethnobotany day?
Yeah, so a lot of research, lots and lots of research. And the more exciting thing would be when they get to go out into the field. So there'll be a community that they either want to establish a relationship with or they already have. They'll go out and then visit these people, talk to them, hopefully speak the language or have a translator there, and ask them about how they use plants in their everyday life. And then they'll catalog these plants, get a bunch of research on them, hopefully get some samples, bring them back, and have a bunch of material to research into the future.
That's amazing. So it really adds stories to these plants.
Yeah.
And it adds context. Do you find that because of ethnobotany, you look at plants differently than you would if you had no knowledge of ethnobotany?
Yeah, of course, because it just gives you so much more context. And there are a lot of plants that, because a lot of people, they think about cultures and they think about far off exotic places they've never been. Culture is also who we were in the past. So there are all of these plants that people used to use in North America that are now just considered weeds.
Right.
And weeds are the plants that are the most successful, so we would have used them in the past.
Of course. I remember my grandmom used to make dandelion salad.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah.
And yeah, so now I can look at these things that are weeds and go, oh, this has use, this has purpose, this can do something interesting.
So we can almost learn from the past how our ancestors used these plants that are all around us and so common that we call them weeds.
Yeah.
And then they don't go to waste anymore if we maybe know a little bit about that. Neat. So how do you use ethnobotany in your current work at the Smithsonian as the Living Collections cataloger?
Yeah, so currently I research a lot of information on trees, and as part of that I'm researching the ethnobotanical and medicinal uses that any of these trees might have had.
Wow.
And because we're very lucky at the Smithsonian in that we don't just have local trees, we also have ones from like more exotic locations. It's a little bit more exciting than just going out and being like, this is an oak tree. There are some interesting things, and so I get to record that information and then share it with the public in the future.
Oh, wow. What plants have been on your mind, just in general, like not just trees, but what plants have been on your mind in your job in the last few weeks that you think might be of interest to people?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned dandelion salad before, because that's actually a plant that I think more people are starting to realize is not just a weed. You see dandelion greens sold in the store because actually every part of a dandelion is edible.
Even the petals?
Yeah, the petals have been used to make dandelion wine. The petals can also be used to make kind of like a greeny yellow dye. And they have a lot of different vitamins in them. They're really good. The leaves are edible, same way like spinach would be, a bit more bitter. And the roots are also edible, but the roots can also be dried and then made into a tea, or they can be roasted and made into like a faux coffee. and it was used to treat a lot of digestive problems and used for like anti-inflammatory purposes.
Wow. Have they studied these properties, and is it actually
so
the
this
case
one,
that it's helpful?
Yeah, the problem with a lot of ethnobotanical information is there's so much of it, and there's not necessarily a lot of funding to actually fund research into it, unless there's a high interest. So there are a lot of things that haven't been verified, but since dandelions are so ubiquitous, and they're also something that was used traditionally in North America and China and in Europe, there was more research into like what are the vitamin compositions, what chemicals does it have. So I believe the anti-inflammatory aspect and like the digestive parts have been researched.
Yeah, my grandma swore by it. I mean, she would go out in the garden and she'd pick dandelion leaves, put them in salad. It was very flavorful salad. You know?
Yeah.
It's a little bit more bitter than you'd expect.
Yeah.
But I remember the taste quite clearly, and I actually kind of miss it sometimes.
Yeah, and with all these, even though you can see them everywhere, I definitely don't recommend eating random dandelions because they could be sprayed with like pesticides.
Oh, yeah.
And that's not a great idea to eat. But if you've grown them yourself, or if you know they haven't been sprayed with pesticides, that's fine.
They were from her yard, so
yeah, those ones sound great.
Yeah. It was in the day. Yeah, she was not going to spray those dandelions. She liked them too much.
Yeah.
Very good. And I understand they're like high in iron too. Is that accurate, or was that just what she thought?
I mean, that would make sense to me since they're dark leafy green and it's similar to spinach.
Okay, well there you go. High in iron, yeah. And when my mother had too much dandelion, she said, "I'm going to turn into a hunk of iron." Very good. So I also understand you've been working with different ways that onions have been used. Obviously we eat onions, but apparently there's far more to the onion than that.
Yeah, so an interesting part of the onion that was used historically, since they have documents going back as far as the Renaissance era of onion skins being used as a dye. So onion skins can actually be, for instance, wrapped around an egg.
I think we have a picture of that, actually, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
They can be wrapped around an egg and then put in boiling water, and it'll leave like a bit of a color on them. And how strong the color is kind of depends on the length of time and also what type of onion skins. But
wow, that's amazing. The picture that we just saw was beautiful. It seems like a real art to it.
Yeah, definitely. If I did it, it would just look kind of plain. But someone who actually knows how to do it, they can do something interesting.
Are there areas or cultures that they do more of that?
Yeah, so traditionally the onion skin dyeing was done very heavily in Europe. That's what the records are of. That's where the records are from for like the Renaissance period.
Oh, neat.
Especially in like Italy and then definitely in Eastern Europe because they have such a like egg dyeing tradition there.
I knew about the egg, and then there's the extreme Fabergé, which is very intricate. But the onion's also a beautiful way to dye the egg, apparently. It's really neat. I did not realize that.
Yeah, definitely.
It all goes together. So you also work with some plants that I haven't heard of, such as quinine?
Quinine, yeah. That one is also very interesting. The two plants I talked about so far, people are going to be more familiar with, but quinine is actually what is in tonic water. So if someone's having a gin and tonic, the bitter flavor comes from the quinine in the tonic water. And the reason that's in there is because English people were using it to combat malaria when they were colonizing Africa.
Oh, so they had quinine on the boat.
Yes. And so quinine and the picture you saw, the bark of that tree comes from like the area of Peru and Ecuador, and was used by the Quechua people to treat like any sort of shivering problems. And so the Jesuits, when they were over there, brought this information back to Europe.
Wow.
And it was actually used to treat a malaria outbreak in Rome, because apparently Rome was like surrounded in these swamps, so they just had all these terrible malaria issues. And that was used from like the 1600s up until 1940 as the main way to treat malaria.
Wow.
Yeah, and
Did it
so
work to some degree?
oh, it worked.
That's all there was, and it worked pretty well.
It like eradicated malaria as a problem in Europe.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and then it was used as a preventative. Unfortunately, it's part of the reason why Europeans were able to so heavily colonize Africa, because before mosquitoes like really blocked that from happening. But
because the Europeans would all catch malaria.
Yes, but then they were able to go in there more efficiently. And there is a really big trade in it as well. Peru and the surrounding countries, they tried to really control the amount of bark that was going out and not have people take the plant and just use it for their own trade, because it was such an economic boon for them.
Sure.
But eventually I think the Dutch managed to smuggle some out, and then they were the ones who were able to trade most highly in it. And interestingly, in World War II, it played a major issue,
really?
Or a major part rather, because it was being grown in the Philippines by the Dutch, and I think the Germans captured that area, so there wasn't any more supply. And I think the Americans had so many seeds, but they still weren't able to grow it all.
Wow.
And there were just a bunch of soldiers who ended up catching malaria. And the same on the opposite side, because they just weren't utilizing it properly.
Yeah.
So malaria was a major part in World War II.
I had no idea. It's all from that little plant, that little quinine.
Yeah,
it's a pretty plant. It's sort of diminutive. You wouldn't think it would have such a big role in world history.
Yeah, plants can be really, really powerful.
Yeah, no kidding. Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, that's something I learned about World War II and quinine. I had no idea.
Yeah.
So, another plant you mentioned that actually had some somewhat amusing medical properties, and we still eat it today, is the caper.
Yeah, so capers, if you get an Italian pasta dish or maybe a salad, anything, there'd be little capers in tiny green guys. Those are flower buds.
Now let's see one of those buds. The caper bud itself, so. Is this what we're looking at? Is that the flower bud?
Yeah, so those will be plucked and put in a briny solution, basically to add a salty flavor.
And is it the inside of that that's kind of the little thing that you see in your salad? It's
that right there.
It's that right there, and it kind of turns black when it gets...
Yeah, when it gets pickled, it loses some of its vibrant color. And so there are historic records of classical Greeks using or eating capers, and they think it was probably the seed rather than the flower, but eating capers for preventing flatulence. Oh,
wow. Very nice.
So when people are eating their pasta, they're like, oh, this is so fancy, it has these capers, and it's just trying to prevent you from having gas.
No kidding.
Yeah.
I'll have to remember that next time and see if it works.
Yeah.
Who knows? Oh, that's funny. So the caper has different stages, of course, as all the plants do. So it's actually a really beautiful flower. And let's see it as it's opening, sort of a mid-opening caper. We kind of have almost a time lapse from before. So that's that same thing that we eat in our pasta. I thought because it tastes good, but apparently to prevent us from flatulating. And then once it blooms and becomes a full flower, it's really impressive to see, because we almost never see the full flower. And there it is. Look at that. So it's got this riot of color.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful flower, and it's just so crazy to think that it's inside of this little bud that we're plucking to eat.
Yeah, it really is. Do you have capers and dandelions and onions and quinine all in the Smithsonian Gardens? I
don't think we can bat the dandelions if we wanted to.
That's a good point.
Yeah, but the capers and the quinine I've all seen at the U.S. Botanic Garden, which we join with sometimes. And we have those in our collections as well, but most easily seen at the U.S. Botanic Garden, and really beautiful. And
is that the building with the glass all around it? Wow. Wonderful. Do you have any last ideas for people who are coming to visit the Smithsonian Gardens? Any advice to visitors for what to look for?
I would always just read the plaque, because oftentimes we're looking at all these plants and going like, oh, that's pretty, that's nice. But there's typically information provided, and then you get to learn so much more and kind of take that with you as you travel through the natural world.
So they make the ethnobotany research easy for the visitor.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I will never look at these few plants that you've talked about today the same way again. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.